This is week 160 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. A quick note before we begin. 2 weeks ago, we introduced a new segment in which members of the Kyiv independent community can submit questions to be answered at the end of each episode. When you become a member of our community, you get access to our Discord server, where there's now a special channel where every week I'll share the topics that we're going to talk about on the show. You guys can submit your questions, and we'll select a few every week to answer. You can find out more about membership at the link in the description below. This week was defined by Russia's first tacit and then more explicit rejection of the 30-day ceasefire proposal brokered by the US. Ukraine had already agreed to the proposal when Russia rejected it, giving pretty heavy credence to the idea that it's Russia, and not Ukraine, that has a vested interest in prolonging the war. This week, US President Donald Trump had a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin with the expressed intent of getting him on board with at least a temporary ceasefire deal. In the lead-up to the call on Tuesday, it was also announced that Trump's administration has deprioritized American efforts to investigate and counteract Russia's systematic abduction of Ukrainian children. Russia has illegally relocated thousands of children from Ukrainian territory into Russian-controlled territory, or Russia itself, since February 2022, with the exact number still unknown. It was also reported by Semaphore that the US was considering officially recognizing occupied Crimea as Russian, undermining every sacrifice made against Russian imperialism in the last 11 years. But no official statement on the matter has been made for now. So, after these alarming indicators, did Trump get Putin to agree to a ceasefire? During the call, Putin did agree to a ceasefire on all of Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days, saying that he'd give the order to the military immediately. To be clear, within this small part of the hoped-for ceasefire that Putin agreed to, it only stipulated the halt of strikes against energy infrastructure, and not any other kind of target, be it military or civilian. The two leaders are also reported to have discussed potential avenues for US-Russia cooperation, ranging from working together to stabilize the Middle East, to arranging professional hockey games. The White House and the Kremlin released separate statements after the call, and people were quick to notice that the length and the wording of the two statements differed in significant ways. The White House's was shorter, vaguer, and expressed hope for an improved future relationship with Russia. The Kremlin, on the other hand, accused Ukrainian soldiers of committing barbaric terrorist crimes, and emphasized that an all-encompassing ceasefire would be possible only if Western military aid and intelligence sharing to Kyiv was entirely halted, and no more Ukrainians were mobilized for the duration, essentially asking Ukraine to disarm while Russia reloads. In short, Trump was able to get Putin to agree to a ceasefire, if defined as one that doesn't require Russia to stop launching drones and missiles at Ukraine. Ironically, less than an hour into the ceasefire, the air raid siren went off in Kyiv, and we had a pretty severe air raid that lasted multiple hours, with Russia sending huge waves of drones to multiple corners of Ukraine. In the 48 hours after the ceasefire was supposed to commence, Russia launched a reported 145 drones, and absolutely no one in Ukraine that I've talked to seems to feel any safer now than they did on Tuesday morning. I'm going to speak plainly. Putin is trying to dominate Trump on the world stage, and it's working. He smoothly accepted the premise Trump offered him, a 30-day ceasefire, without conceding a single practical thing that would halt Russia's current method of waging war, and in fact, tipping the scale in Russia's favor, with Trump failing to call him on it and failing to enforce any consequences whatsoever when the agreement was immediately violated. It's clear that Trump sees Putin as a peer, but one has to question if the sentiment is one-sided. I also want to return quickly to the unlikely topic of hockey. As I said, Trump and Putin discussed setting up games between the NHL and the KHL, the equivalent professional hockey league for Russian players. Although two presidents setting up a hockey game for their own symbolic pleasure might not seem like the worst concession to make during a war, international sports competitions have always been inherently political and performative. Professional hockey in Russia, like most professional sports in Russia, is deeply tied to the government, the military, and billions of dollars in oligarch money. And for the past 3 years, Russia's 20 professional teams have been relegated to playing against one Belarusian team, one Kazakh team, and one Chinese team, as other countries withdrew from the league after the start of the full-scale invasion. For Putin, a notorious hockey aficionado, Trump's commitment to planning games between America and Russia is a prize given freely, with unclear gains for anyone except Russia. After the call with Putin on Tuesday, Trump spoke with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in an hour-long conversation that seems to have been neutrally good, with both presidents saying that it was productive, but no real progress being made. On Wednesday, White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said that one security guarantee for Ukraine could come in the form of the US taking over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, although it's incredibly unclear how this could work, as the plant is currently occupied by Russia. This echoes something that we've heard from Trump in various forms, that Ukraine could be protected in the future not by American troops or NATO membership, but by America taking ownership of Ukrainian resources and institutions, and installing investors and businesses on Ukrainian soil that would deter Russia from reattacking and reinvading. There's what seems to be a heavy dose of cognitive dissonance in these suggestions. As long as there's a threat of Russia reinvading, and no Western military presence on the ground to deter them from doing so, the overwhelming majority of investors aren't going to be willing to take the risk on setting up large-scale, long-term operations in Ukraine, making Trump's suggestions confusing and ultimately insubstantial. If it didn't work for Atlantic City, it probably won't work for a country at war. In the past couple of weeks, my colleagues Francis Farrell and Olena Zashko have been traveling to different European cities for screenings of their documentary film, Can You Hear Me?, which follows the journey of Ukrainian military medics as they deal with the psychological toll of preserving life under the most brutal of circumstances. The documentary premiered here in Kyiv in December and has since been shown in nearly 20 cities in Europe and beyond. I spoke to Francis to find out how it's going. Okay, thank you for talking to us. This won't take long. I just have a few questions for us. Number one is, how has the film been received on the tour so far?
It's been great. Compared to the tour that we did in December, where we went through all Nordic and Baltic countries, this was more relaxed and more focused. And now the focus is on Western Europe, because they're the ones that need to make, I think, brave decisions for Ukraine first and foremost. And it was a reminder, I think, for a lot of the people who watched it, that the war is not about just endless flows of weapons, but it's first and foremost being fought by humans, and those humans have limited resources to keep going forever, as long as it takes, like they like to say.
And I mean, obviously, you know, there's the film and also the process of going around. Kind of, this has been a very crazy month. How has it felt touring at this time and sort of engaging with people in different parts of Europe?
Well, right when the initial agreement with the Americans on the 30-day ceasefire came out, that was in the middle of our screening in Strasbourg. So everyone was kind of reacting to it in real time. And it's been quite surreal to be on this merry-go-round of news around a ceasefire while doing this. I think it's been an important time, but I think this merry-go-round will eventually stop, and it might not stop in a good place for Ukraine, and that's the moment when specifically Europeans will need to step up.
And I mean, you've kind of touched on this already with both answers, but at this time, what do you hope that people take from the documentary? You know, what message do you hope it shows people about the human side of Ukraine?
It will make people wake up and realize that the only reason that we're not now talking about Russian troops, green men, you know, streaming into the Baltic states or something like that is because of these humans, these heroes who are holding them back right there in eastern Ukraine. And it's just not acceptable for more not being done for these people.
Thank you so much. And thank you for speaking with us, as well as for doing this work, obviously. The full documentary can be found here on our YouTube channel. There will be a link to it in the description below. If you would like to organize a screening in your city, please fill out the form linked in the description below, and we'll be in touch about how to make it happen. On Tuesday, Russia's defense ministry reported that Ukrainian forces attempted a ground assault into Russia's Belgorod Oblast, which borders Ukraine's Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts. In turn, Ukrainian forces reported the successful destruction of a Russian command post near Demidovka, over a mile into the Russian border in Belgorod. There have been a few reports throughout the full-scale invasion of small incursions into Belgorod, but there's never been a wide-scale offensive launched there, which makes it notable as sustaining the foothold in neighboring Kursk Oblast remains a difficult task for Ukraine. Some say, however, that the incursion might not be that at all, but rather an attempt by Russia to paint a typical border skirmish as an act of unusual aggression by Ukraine. Andriy Kovalenko, the head of counter-disinformation at Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, said that cross-border artillery attacks are not at all uncommon, and that Russia may simply be choosing to highlight them at this time in hopes of painting Ukraine as an aggressor. President Zelensky has declined to say concretely one way or another whether Ukraine is indeed staging a new offensive in Belgorod, instead reiterating that Ukraine is fulfilling its objectives in Kursk while acting to deter new Russian offensives in Sumy, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia oblasts. Regardless of Tuesday's vague and incomplete ceasefire agreement, this week saw heavy airstrikes from Russia on cities across Ukraine, with Sumy, Kropyvnytsky, and Odessa among those battered by brutal attacks. In return, early on Thursday morning, Ukraine conducted a drone strike on Russia's Engels Air Base in Saratov Oblast. This base houses strategic bombers used in aerial assaults on Ukraine. The strike resulted in large fires, explosions, and secondary detonations of ammunition at the facility. Behind the front lines, Ukraine is hard at work training new drone pilots in the skills and techniques needed to face an ever-evolving battlefield. My colleague Colin traveled to the city of Dnipro to see firsthand how it's done.
Drones have become integral to Ukraine's fight against Russia today, partially because the unmanned systems make up for Ukraine's lack of manpower relative to a larger opponent. The pilots who are training spend several days in the classroom before they get on simulators, and they run simulators for an extended period of time before they're allowed onto the field.
Тільки було 17 років, я почав тим всім цікавитись. Суто загалом мавіки, отакі, знаєте, типу, дрібні самольотики такі. Я бачу, як ситуація просто погіршується. І я для себе зробив такий висновок, що може я один щось не зроблю там, знаєте, хоч якийсь я вклад зроблю в свою державу, в свою армію.
We are out here in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast watching some of the newest pilots in drones army pass their final exams with one of the most famous of all ISR drones, the Belokur 100.
Можна сказати, всеоб'ємлююче навчання, є імітація саме умов ведення бойових дій. Корисно буде нам для використання цього борта у бойових діях саме.
Regardless of ongoing ceasefire negotiations and whether or not this phase of the war ends shortly, Ukraine is hoping that its drone expertise and engineering will serve it well in the next phase.
Our last story isn't strictly from Ukraine, but its themes are familiar enough that it bears telling. Serbs are taking to the streets in the hundreds of thousands in protests that call to mind Ukraine's 2013 to 2014 Euromaidan revolution. These protests were sparked in November of last year, when a tragic incident became a rallying point. The newly reconstructed roof of the Novi Sad train station collapsed, resulting in the deaths of 15 individuals. That accident, if it can be called that, was widely attributed to shady practices in the construction process, which had been expedited using state funds without proper oversight. Outraged by the deaths and the systemic corner-cutting that led to them, Serbia's university students initiated protests demanding accountability and justice from their government, a government which is incidentally one of the most Kremlin-aligned in Europe. The movement quickly gained momentum, spreading to over 60 cities and towns across Serbia, with the image of a bloody hand emerging as a symbol of the protests. Since the beginning of March, the protests have been building to a fever pitch. Last weekend, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić gave an address drawing parallels between the current demonstrations and Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution. He vowed to protect and defend Serbia from a similar scenario, accusing protest organizers of spreading misinformation, including claims that authorities had jammed the internet and used sonic cannons against demonstrators. The Euromaidan revolution was the moment that Ukrainians stood up en masse to a government that sought closer ties with Moscow over an integrated future with the West. It was perhaps the single most consequential event in modern Ukrainian history, and one that gave Ukraine a shot at a democratic future that it never could have achieved under the Kremlin's control. By ousting the pro-Moscow regime, Ukrainians chose their own future, so we'll be keeping an eye on what Serbs decide for theirs. For our member question today, we have this from Christopher. What should Ukraine and the international community do regarding Russian violations of a ceasefire? First, I'm going to speak directly to my fellow American citizens. Call your congresspeople. Find out who your congresspeople are, call them on the phone, and tell whoever answers that you want your representative to advocate harder for Ukraine. The more specific you can be, the better. It doesn't matter if you don't get through to your actual representative. The person answering the phone will have a spreadsheet where they keep track of how many people call in to talk about a particular issue, and then they'll brief their boss about what issues their constituents are calling about, and what the sentiment is behind the calls. It is literally these people's job to listen to you. For those both in the United States and outside of it, it's also of the utmost importance to just keep eyes on the situation and not allow Russian disinformation to paint the war as being over. Sharing social media posts, continuing to donate, and continuing to boycott Russian institutions are acts of defiance that can only work if people continue to participate. With that being said, thank you so much for participating by watching our videos and reading our articles. We're so glad to have you. That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. At the Kyiv Independent, reader contributions are our main source of revenue. Shows like Ukraine This Week are only made possible by the donations, big and small, of viewers like you. If you'd like to get more involved in the Kyiv Independent community, we have several membership tiers that give you access to our Discord community, where, as I said before, you can ask questions to be featured on the show, Q&As with our staff, and a 15% discount on our merch. There will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.